The Grey King by Susan Cooper. 2. The Sleepers. The Girl from the Mountains. Will said, "Excuse me, Mr. Davies, is Bran home from school yet?" Owen Davies jerked upright. He had been bent over the engine of a tractor in one of the farm outhouses. His thin hair was ruffled and his face smeared with oil. "I'm sorry," Will said. "I made you jump." "No, no, boy, that's all right. I was just a bit further away than this engine, I think." He made a quick apologetic grimace that seemed to be as near as he ever came to a smile. All the lines of his thin face seemed to lead nowhere, Will thought. No expression, ever. "Bran is home. Yes, I think you will find him in the house, or up by—" His light, worried voice trailed away. Will said softly, "By Castle." They had buried the dog the evening before, up on the lower slope of the mountain, with a heavy stone over the grave to keep predators away. "Yes, I think so, up there," Owen Davies said. Will wanted suddenly to say something, but the words were slippery. "Mr. Davies, I'm sorry about that. All of it, yesterday. It was awful." "Well, yes, now, thank you." Owen Davies was embarrassed, flinching from the contact with emotion. He said, looking down into the tractor's engine, "It couldn't be helped. You can never tell when a dog may take it into his head to go for the sheep. It is 1 in a million, but it can happen. Even the best dog in the world." He looked up suddenly, and for once his eyes met Will's, though they seemed to be looking not at him, but beyond into a future or the past. His voice came firmer, like that of a younger man. "I do think, mind you, that Caradog Pritchard was very ready to shoot the dog. That is something very drastic, and not done normally to another man's creature, or at any rate not before his face. We were all there. It would have been nothing to catch Caffel. And a sheep chaser can sometimes be given a home, somewhere away from sheep, without having to be killed. But I cannot say this to Bran, and nor must you either. It would not help him." He flicked his eyes away again, and Will watched, fascinated and disturbed, as the bright echo of another time dropped away like a coat and left the familiar drab Owen Davies with his humorless, slightly guilty air. "Well," said Will, "I think you are right, but no, I wouldn't mention it to Bran. I'll go and look for him now." "Yes," Owen Davies said eagerly, turning his anxious, helpless face to the hills. "Yes, you could help him, I believe." But Will knew, as he trudged along the muddy lane, that there was small chance he, or anyone of the light, could comfort Bran. When he reached the edge of the valley, where the land began to climb, he saw, very small and distant above him, halfway up the mountain, the figure of John Rowland, like a toy man. His 2 dogs, black and white specks, moved to and fro. Will looked irresolute at the place further down the valley where Bran would have gone to earth, alone with his misery. Then, on an instant, he began to climb straight up, through the bracken and gorse. John Rowland might be a good person to talk to first. Nevertheless, it was Bran he saw first. He came upon him suddenly, without expecting it. He was part way up the slope, panting hard as he still did on rising ground. And as he paused for breath, raising his head, he saw there before him, sitting on a rock, the familiar figure, dark jeans and sweater, white hair like a beacon, smoky glasses over the pale eyes, but the eyes were not visible now. But the glasses were not visible now, nor the eyes, for Bran sat with his head bent down, immobile, even though Will knew he must have heard the noisy puffing of his approach. He said, "Hello, Bran." Bran raised his head slowly, but said nothing. Will said, "There was no dog like him, ever, anywhere." "No, there was not," Bran said. His voice was small and husky. He sounded tired. Will cast about to find words of comfort, but his mind could not help but use the wisdom of an old one, and that was not the way to reach Bran. He said, "It was a man who killed him, Bran, and that is the price we have to pay for the freedom of men on the earth. They can do the bad things as well as the good. There are shadows in the pattern, as well as sunlight. Just as you once told me, Caffel was no ordinary dog. He was part of the long pattern, like the stars in the sea, and nobody could have played his part better, nobody in the whole world." The valley was quiet under its brooding grey sky. Will heard only a song thrush trilling from a tree, the scattered voices of sheep on the slopes, the faint humming from the distant road of a passing car. Bran raised his head and took off his glasses. The tawny eyes were swollen and red-rimmed in his white face. He sat there hunched, knees bent up, arms dangling limp over them. "Go away," he said. "Go away. I wish you had never come here. I wish I had never heard of the light and the dark and your damned old Merriman and his rhymes. If I had your golden harp now, I would throw it in the sea. I am not part of your stupid quest any more. I don't care what happens to it. And Cavil was never part of it either, or part of your pretty pattern. He was my dog, and I loved him more than anything in the world, and now he is dead. Go away!" The red-rimmed eyes stared cold and unwinking at Will for a long moment, and then Bran put back his smoky glasses and turned his head to look out across the valley. It was a dismissal. Without a word, Will stood straight again and plodded on up the hill. It seemed a long time before he reached John Rowland's. The lean, leathery sheepman was crouched half-kneeling over a broken fence, mending it from a prickly sheen of barbed wire. He set back on his heels as Will came panting up, and looked at him through narrowed eyes. His seamed brown face crinkled against the brightness of the sky. With no greeting, he said, "This is the top level of a cloud pasture here. The hill farms have been grazing beyond. The fence is to keep our sheep below, but they are crafty beggars at breaking it, especially now with the rams are out." Will nodded miserably. John Rowland looked at him for a moment, then got up and beckoned him over to a high outcropping of rock a little way up the mountain. They sat down on its lee side. Even there, the place was like a lookout post, governing the whole valley. Will glanced round him briefly, his senses alert, but the grey king lay still, withdrawn. The valley was as quiescent as it had been since the moment Cathal had died. John Rowland said, "There is the rest of the fence to check, but I am ready for a break. I have a thermos here. Would you like a mouthful of tea, Will?" He gave him the thermos, top brimming with bitter brown tea. Will surprised himself by drinking thirstily. When he had finished, John Rowland said softly, "Did you know we were sitting near Cadfan's Way here?" Will looked at him sharply. It was not the look of an 11-year-old, and he did not trouble to disguise the fact. "Yes," he said, "of course I did. And you knew that I knew, and that's why you mentioned it." John Rowland sighed and poured himself some tea. "I dare say," he said in a curious tone that had envy in it, "that you could now walk blindfold all the way from Tywin to Macalnith, over the hills on Cadfan's Way, even though you have never been in this country before." Will pushed back his straight brown hair, damp on his forehead from the climbing. "The old ways are all over Britain," he said, "and we can follow one anywhere, once we have found it. Yes," he looked out across the valley, "it was Bran's dog who found it for me up here in the beginning," he said sadly. John Rowlands pushed back his cloth cap, scratched his head, and pulled it forward again. "I have heard of you people," he said, "all my life on and off, though not much these days. More when I was a boy. Even used to think I'd met one of you once, when I was very young, though I dare say it was only a dream. And now I've been thinking about the way the dog died, and I have talked a bit to young Bran." He broke off, and Will looked nervously to see what he might say next, but did not choose to use his art to find out. "And I think, Will Stanton," said the sheepman, "that I ought to be helping you in any way that you might need, but I do not know what you are doing. I do not want you to explain it to me at all." Will felt suddenly as if the sun had burst out. "Thank you," he said. The smaller of John Rowland's dogs, Tip, came quietly over and sat down at his feet. He rubbed the silky ears. John Rowlands looked down over the bracken-brown slope. Will's gaze followed his. Just above the blackened land, where the fire had grazed, they could see the tiny figure that was Bran, sitting hunched with his back to them, his white head propped on his knees. "This is a very bad time for Bran Davies," the shepherd said. "I'm glad he talked to you," Will said bleakly. "He wouldn't talk to me. Not that I blame him. He'll be so lonely without Cathal. I mean, Mr. Davies is nice, but not exactly." And not having any mother, too, that makes it worse. Bran never knew his mother, John Rowland said. He was too small. Will said curiously, what was she like? Rowland drank his tea, shook his cup, and screwed it back onto the flask. Her name was Gwen, he said. He held the flask absent-mindedly in his hands, looking past it into his memory. She was one of the prettiest things you ever seen. Small, with a clear, fair skin, and black hair, and blue eyes like a speedwell, and smiling light in her face that was like music. But she was a strange, wild girl, too. Out of the mountains she came, and never would tell us where she came from or how. He turned abruptly and looked hard at Will with the dark eyes that seemed always to be narrowed against fierce weather. I should have thought, he said with sudden belligerence, that being what you are, you would know all about Bran. Will said gently, I don't know anything about Bran, except what he has told me. We are not really so very different from you, Mr. Rowland, most of us. Only our masters are different. We do know many things, but they are not things that intrude on the lives of men. In that we are like anyone else. We know only what we have lived through, or what somebody has told us. John Rowland nodded his head, relenting. He opened his mouth to say something, stopped, pulled his pipe from his pocket, and poked at its contents with one finger. Well, he said slowly, perhaps I should tell you the story from the start. It will help you to understand Bran. He knows some of it well enough. Himself, indeed, he thinks about it so much on his own that I wish he had never been told. Will said nothing. He sat closer to Tip and put one arm